Thank you all for coming out this beautiful night. My name is Herman Rosenfeld. I'm with Free Transit Toronto, among other things, and I'll be chairing this evening. And what we were going to have a forum on how free transit fits into this whole thing, and then a number of people in the group said, why don't we do something broader and talk about analogous radical alternatives that are not being posed as part of the electoral package municipally, and of course at any other level really. So we decided to do that, but we had to make choices when we did that. Just in general, we're in the thick of a series of very fast-moving and complex events. It's hard to keep your head above water just to try and figure stuff out. Tied to the horrible result of the recent provincial election, which placed Ford and the PCs in power. And we're living with the effects of their political and economic agenda coming fast and furious. And we understand that they're just sort of beginning, even though just about every day was Natalie from the Ontario Health Coalition told us that every day since they were elected, there have been 2 cuts they've announced, and we don't hear about them. But the turmoil of the municipal election being held in the shadow of the PC's move to further transform the electoral map and restructure the local state to facilitate their agenda, and make no mistake, that's what they're doing. And while we have allies in the social democratic left in the legislature and city, there's a void in the lack of any larger electoral or political voice for socialists and the radical left. I say larger voice, representing the working class as a whole, unions, people living with low incomes and on social assistance, those seeking decent, secure jobs with decent pay, the tens of thousands without adequate and affordable housing, those living in the shadows of immigration laws and policing, and others. One can make this list really long. And part of the problem is that to do this properly, you need a weekend or a whole day where every one of these issues gets voiced by people who are active in them, but we couldn't really do that. Challenges to the power of developers, real estate and financial interests, large private capital, the privatizers, opposition to sponsors of repression instead of community building and opportunity, and neoliberal politicians are not being heard. We have no real political organization or voices, although we do have movements and small nodes and spaces in which we speak up, and we have some allies. Tonight, the Free Transit Toronto movement, co-sponsored by the Socialist Project and the Center for Social Justice, want to make a modest contribution to bringing in more radical and fundamental approaches to these critical issues. So we provided this forum. We have speakers from the Fight for 15, housing movement, No One is Illegal, and immigration and refugee and migrant workers, creating and not creating good jobs, free transit, and an overall issue of discussing some of the experiences of people on the left. This is clearly not exhaustive. Doing this right would require a longer time, and there are other spaces to do this sort of thing. You can talk about all kinds of stuff, healthcare, policing and challenging the police and building our communities differently. A whole series of things. But even so, we packed this with a number of speakers, and I'm sorry we couldn't do more, but I think all of us are sort of hungry for these kinds of discussions and some idea of what's going to happen. So we'll have people speaking for 10 minutes apiece, and then we'll take comments and questions, and we'll respond, but I'm sure that a lot of you all want to be able to say some things. I see some mayoral candidates and people who are supporting other kind of movements, and that's just wonderful because we want to be able to provide a space for that kind of a thing. So I want to start with our first speaker is a speaker from the Fight for 15, which is obviously still happening, and you might have had a day of action on Saturday. They've been active for a very long time, and now that the provincial government is sort of announcing that they basically want to undercut some of the potential and real gains they've made. The speaker is Dan Karasik, right? He's an organizer.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I'm filling in for Elia Kareem, who's another organizer with our movement. My name is Daniel Karasik, and I've been volunteering with this campaign since about January of this year. And so I've watched as the movement has changed from one in a kind of celebratory mood, looking at the enacting of the passing of the law, Bill 148, which enshrined the $14 minimum wage set to go to $15 this coming January, and a whole bunch of other labor protections that are some of the biggest gains for workers in Ontario in a couple of decades. Watched as that sort of celebratory mood has changed to one of increasing jitters as it's become clear that these gains would be a target for attack. If Doug Ford won, and then Doug Ford won. So where we are now, and some of you will probably be familiar with this, it's been pretty visible. So the Ontario Chamber of Commerce has now called on the government to completely repeal Bill 148, which brought into law all of those sorts of labor protections. Doug Ford briefly, while campaigning, said that he planned to cancel the $15 minimum wage increase to freeze it at $14. He didn't belabor this point because I think it was clear, the campaign also thinks that it was clear to him that even in his base, there was not a lot of support for rolling back these kinds of gains. I mean, his movement is obviously trying to present itself as a populist one, as one for the people, and so he can't, I think there's been the sense that he can't very clearly or directly attack these sorts of wins, but they are a big juicy target. So what the Fight for 15 and Fairness campaign has been trying to do since the election, the kind of dominant strategy has been to identify ridings where conservative MPPs won by a slim margin, some of them by under 1,000 votes, and to be in the streets in those ridings as often as possible, gathering names for petitions, gathering contact information, and building on the already 40% of Doug Ford's base that supports what we have won. And a clear majority of the public, as polling data has shown, supports the stuff that the wins that the campaign has made. So we're trying at this point to hold on to those wins. And so this panel is about the election and electoralism. And for me, the connection between the campaign and electoral politics in this moment is that this is clearly a radicalizing moment for layers of the public who we have maybe not seen radicalized before. They are realizing that some of the planks of the liberal democratic social contract are made of smoke or are made of something slightly more material but not quite, are made of much. And so one question has been, where do these people whose analysis is changing, where do they go? How can that be sort of absorbed when we don't have sort of many working class organizational forums that are accessible in a variety of ways locally? And it seemed to me, as somebody who, I was living in the States for a while, I moved back here, and the Fight for 15 was not the first organizing space I found, but was certainly the one that seemed to me the most dynamic in terms of absorption capacity and basic things like data entry and outreach to people who've been enrolled in the campaign, keeping people sort of engaged week to week, and getting radicalizing people into spaces where they can build relationships with others who have been radicalized or whatever, and through those relationships to kind of change people's analysis and expand working class politics in the city. So there are some signs that strategy or that effect has been a real one in the campaign. So in the months before the provincial election, the campaign's database doubled from 8,000 to 16,000 people. So those are people who have been in some way brought in, whose information is recorded, who are reached out to through phone banking and these sorts of things on a regular basis. And I think for me, a lot of the appeal of the campaign, I'm not trying to do like a sales pitch for it, but I think the role it can play in the sort of movement ecology of the city now is that it can give some material form to this notion that gets repeated, that politics is more than anything what happens between the elections, that we're trying to sort of divest or disinvest from this sort of liberal notion that to be active politically you have to show up and vote. You should do that, but also like what are the relationships you can build in the spaces between elections, and how can that cohere into sort of movements from below. So I found the Fight for 15 and Fairness to be a really sort of exciting space for that. It's also, to my mind, It's doing some work in the city in terms of bringing together, in some ways, if a fairly sort of conventional class analysis of trying to sort of polarize around the situation of labor and capital in the city. Thank you. But with like a really sort of solid anti-oppression piece too. So, not only does the campaign's work imply in itself an anti-racist and an anti-sexist analysis, since a large proportion of minimum wage workers are themselves women or gender nonconforming, racialized, recent immigrants. It is also a genuinely multiracial and gender diverse organizing space, covers a lot of ground in terms of organizers' ages and other sorts of backgrounds. One question I have sort of looking forward is, if the campaign does play a role in mobilizing new layers of the public, does the sort of decentralized movement form that the campaign takes, is that sort of a sustainable or a tenable sort of long time organizational form for radical politics in the city? Where does the sort of working class party or mass membership association, where does that fit, or that sort of notion fit? Is there a role for that to play in dialogue with from below movement organizing, like the 515 and fairness? That's a sort of medium range question. But yeah, I guess my interest is in centering the work we're doing as a sort of absorption space for people who are coming into radical left politics as a result of questions being raised for them by the election and stuff going on around it. Thanks a lot.